grand theft, battery, burglary, petty theft, and first-degree murder. All are things done by a man named Wade Wilson. And I'm not talking about the Deadpool Wade Wilson. I'm talking about the real-life Wade Wilson. All of that and more are topics we're about to dive into, but first I do just want to ask you guys to like this video if you end up enjoying it, and subscribe, of course, if you end up wanting to see more. And with that out of the way, let's hop right into this Joker wannabe looking man. So Wade Wilson was born on May 20th of 1994. His mother was a drug addict, along with having a lot of different mental health issues, and his father was just completely MIA out of the picture. So given that he didn't have the best living situation, he was given up for adoption when he was still a baby. And he was adopted by a family that went to the same church as his birth mother, these people being the Wilsons. Now, the Wilson family was definitely a step up from what his life would have been had he stayed with his birth mother. They went to church, they drove luxury cars, they had a really nice home, and they really just did their best in raising Wade as best they could. However, his family says that around the age that Wade was 13 is when things just really flipped a switch and took a turn for the worst. And Wade's behavior started to go downhill. And it was only downhill from there. And around the age of 13 is also when Wade said he began to dip his toe into substances. And this, of course, would reflect in his behavior in school and at home. He also, at this age, began to isolate himself and, like, really start to get paranoid. So, of course, he started to get into trouble a lot at school. Him and his friends would often sneak away into the bathroom to smoke a little weed. They would also grab, like, a whole toilet paper roll and just light it on fire. I don't know how that would be fun, but go off, I guess. And this type of behavior would obviously result in him getting expelled from a lot of schools. So at this point, I wouldn't say things are too bad, but just wait. It's coming, I promise. Now, with the intense media coverage based around this case, one of Wade's ex-girlfriends, Kelly Mathews, has actually come out and shared one of her stories, obviously coming forward against Wade. The two met online in 2018, and things were going relatively pretty well, but that was up until Wade started using a snowy-looking substance. One night, Wade and Kelly had ended up getting into a fight, and Kelly locked herself in a room and started digging through Wade's bag to look for said snowy substance, which of course would cause Wade to snap, and he proceeded to kick the door down to get into the room and threw her into the kitchen table. And this was only the beginning of Wade's highly deteriorating behavior. A couple of days after that fight, Kelly had convinced Wade to go to a nearby rehab. However, he ended up backing out last minute and instead wanted to go to one that was 3 hours away for some reason. And this would lead to, yet again, Wade and Kelly having an argument, only this time it was in a parking lot. Kelly was just very insistent that he wanted to go to the rehab 3 hours away because he wanted to meet up with some other woman other than her. And when they went to get back in the car, Wade began strangling her, and it was to the point where she completely blacked out. He then proceeded to throw her on the floorboard of the car and then get out a knife and cut her clothes off. He also broke her foot by slamming the car door onto her foot. He then bound her, gagged her, and essayed her. But don't worry, because it still gets worse, because Wade proceeds to drive to McDonald's with Kelly still gagged and bound in his back seat. This is how I see that going down.
Yeah, hi, let me get a number one. You can ignore her. She's taking a nap. So, can I get a number one?
But anyways, I digress. He ends up eventually parking and unties her, and he just hands her the keys to the car, gets out of the car, walks over to another car with another woman in it, hops in, and just drives away. What? Like, that's a casual thing. A casual event here. Nothing crazy. What? And as literally any sane person would do in this situation, Kelly obviously drives straight to the nearest police station. And the detectives there would do nothing about it. They just assumed that she was into that kind of thing and moved on. And a couple months after that whole event, Wade Wilson would proceed to kill two women hours apart from each other. Kristine Melton grew up in Illinois and moved out to Cape Coral with a friend, where she worked as a waitress. Kristine absolutely loved to dress up, and her favorite holiday was Halloween. Her cousin, while testifying in court, said that Kristine was the type of person to make everyone around her feel safe and understood. And Kristine was 35 years old when she met Wade Wilson at a local bar. The two ended up talking all night long, and by the end of the night actually ended up going home together. Wade and Kristine, along with some other friends, would spend the rest of the night at their friend Jason's house. And they stayed there throughout the night, and around the morning time is when they would go back to Kristine's house. Now, one of Kristine's friends ended up going with them over to Kristine's house, so Wade waited until that friend left before he proceeded to strangle Kristine in her sleep, which did in fact kill her. And then, if that wasn't bad enough for you, he then proceeded to steal her car without a care in the world. And then he took said stolen car and drove off to meet his girlfriend Melissa Montanez. Now, thankfully, Montanez just refused to get into the car with him. However, this did cause Wade to beat the ever-living shit out of her in the middle of broad daylight. So when Melissa ended up escaping the scene, he also ran and drove back to Cape Coral. And that was where he decided that he was going to murder another person. Diane Ruiz was a 43-year-old mother and also at the time was engaged, and she was described as being extremely caring and a very hardworking woman. Diane was a bartender in Cape Coral and was walking towards the bar for her 10 a.m. shift, and that was when she encountered Wade Wilson, still driving Kristine's car, which is... won't get into that, but he pulls over right up next to Diane and kind of pretends to ask for directions, and somehow he was able to lure her into the car to get her to give him the directions. And when Diane tried to leave the car is when Wade Wilson, yet again, started beating her up and strangling her. He then pushed her out of the car and ran her over with Kristine's car several times until she died. And Diane's body was discovered by police about 3 days later in a random field. After the murders, Wade proceeded to call his biological father several times, confessing to the crimes that he had just committed in grave detail. Now, at first his father thought that Wade was just talking out of his ass, but after hearing the same story in extreme detail several times, he put Wade on speakerphone with his wife in the room listening in. She would proceed to feed all of the information Wade was giving them to the police. And they asked Wade where he was so they could order him an Uber, obviously lying, and they instead gave his whereabouts to the police, where on October 8th of 2019, at an unoccupied home that Wade had broken into, the police made their arrest. Wade Wilson's trial began on June 1st and lasted give or take about 2 weeks. And throughout the entire trial, it was just made extremely prevalent that Wade could not give a singular about what he had done to these women. Really, the blank look on his face throughout this entire 2-week trial speaks volumes about how little he cares.
We, the jury, finds as follow as to the defendant in this case. Count 1, first-degree murder, Kristine Melton. The defendant is guilty of first-degree murder. Count 2, grand theft motor vehicle. The defendant is guilty of grand theft motor vehicle. Count 3, battery. The defendant is guilty of battery. Count 4, first-degree murder, Diane Ruiz. The defendant is guilty of first-degree murder. Count 5, burglary of dwelling. The defendant is guilty of burglary of a dwelling. Count 6, first-degree petty theft. The defendant is guilty of first-degree petty theft.
And on June 12th is when the jury found Wade Wilson to be guilty in the 2019 murders of 35-year-old Kristine Melton and 43-year-old Diane Ruiz. And the jury also recommended the death penalty for each life that Wade had taken, which, thank God, he got.
The totality of the circumstances warrants that the defendant, Wade Stephen Wilson, be sentenced to death for each count of first-degree murder. Accordingly, it is ordered and adjudged that the defendant, Wade Stephen Wilson, be sentenced as follows. Count 1, first-degree murder of Kristine Melton. The defendant is hereby sentenced to death. Count 2, grand theft of a motor vehicle. The defendant is sentenced to 5 years imprisonment in the Florida Department of Corrections. Count 3, battery. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 364 days in the Lee County Jail. Count 4, first-degree murder of Diane Ruiz. The defendant is hereby sentenced to death. Count 5, the burglary of a dwelling. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 15 years imprisonment in the Florida Department of Corrections. Count 6, petty theft. The defendant is hereby sentenced to 364 days in Lee County Jail. The defendant is given credit for all time served on this case on all counts. All counts are to run concurrent with each other, meaning at the same time. All statutorily mandated fines, fees, and costs as announced on the record are imposed, and the defendant is committed to the custody of the Department of Corrections for execution of this sentence as provided by law. The defendant is hereby notified that these convictions and sentences are subject to automatic review by the Florida Supreme Court. If he cannot afford an attorney to represent him in any appeal, the court will appoint one for him.
So that was a quick little deep dive into the absolutely horrific and disturbing case of Wade Wilson, also known as the Deadpool killer. Let me know what you guys think about this case in the comments. I think it's absolutely horrific, and I think this man is just... ugh. But thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you all in the next video. Bye! Flip is when a flip is when a... flip. Switch! Switch! The word is switch! Flip! I can't.